Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Be Like Christ for our Gospel of Luke Bible study. We are in chapter 14. We're going to try to cover almost the first half, verses 1 through 14, in today's study. If you have the notes, we're on page 39 of volume 2, and if you don't, there are links down in the description. Okay, verse 1. One Sabbath, when he went to dine in the house of a ruler of the Pharisees, they were watching him carefully. It's kind of interesting to me that the Pharisees repeatedly invited Jesus over to their houses to eat for nefarious purposes, to catch him doing something or to accuse him of something. And of course he knew this, and yet he continually accepted their invitation. We saw this happen in chapter 11. And I'm not sure who this Pharisee thought that he was, or the people who were gathering in this room. I don't know who they thought they were fooling with their phony friendship. Jesus obviously could see through this. And this particular day was a Sabbath day. So let's read verses 2 through 6. And behold, there was a man before him who had dropsy. And Jesus responded to the lawyers and the Pharisees, saying, "Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath or not?" But they remained silent. And then he took him, and he healed him, and sent him away. And he said to them, "Which of you, having a son or an ox that has fallen into a well on a Sabbath day, will not immediately pull him out?" And they could not reply to these things. This man comes in to this assembly of Pharisees and Jesus and scribes, and also lawyers. I guess it says lawyers and Pharisees. So the lawyers and the Pharisees, they're all around the table, and a man comes in, has dropsy. What is dropsy? Well, it's an old term for what we might call in the modern day edema. Edema is the buildup of fluid in the body tissue. So a person that has edema, they retain water, and it causes them to swell. A lot of times you see it in their arms and their legs. And from my expert nurse practitioning wife, she told me that this is often caused by kidney problems. So maybe your kidneys aren't functioning, your kidneys filter water, and you can't shed that water as quickly, so it builds up in your body. She's a nephrologist, which is like a kidney specialist, so she knows this stuff. I have the inside connections for all of my research. Anyway, so dropsy would have been a outwardly observable symptom of probably a deeper problem, whether it was kidney failure or whether it was like heart disease. That can also happen with people that have heart problems. Jesus healed the man, and then he dismissed them. And he did that knowing that the Pharisees and the lawyers were going to have an issue with it. And Jesus challenges the Pharisees and the lawyers with a similar question that he posed to them in Luke chapter 9. He goes ahead, and even before they say anything, he challenges them before they even have an opportunity to speak. Luke chapter 6, verse 9 is when Jesus healed the man with the withered hand in the synagogue. In that text, Jesus asked, "Is it lawful on the Sabbath day to do good or to do harm, to save life or to destroy it?" Here Jesus says, "Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath or not?" We've kind of discussed this, but accusing Jesus of common everyday work that would break Sabbath restrictions because of his miraculous healings, that seems like it was kind of already a stretch. But I guess when the Jewish authorities, they didn't have much else to accuse him of, so they had to go with what they thought that they could use, and evidently they thought that they could use this, but they were very wrong. And after this, hopefully, most of them realized that they needed to abandon this argument. So Jesus goes ahead and he challenges them, and it says that none of them dared answer. So Jesus proceeded to explain why none of them had the right to accuse him. He says, "Which of you, having a son or an ox that has fallen into a well on the Sabbath day, will not immediately pull it out?" So the lawyers and the Pharisees, they wouldn't have hesitated to, quote, break the Sabbath laws. They felt that they would have a rightful exception to the Sabbath restrictions if their ox or their son fell into a well, and needed help getting out, that wouldn't be a problem. They could do that and not break the law. And they considered, but in doing that, and evidently this was just like universally accepted because nobody challenges Jesus on this thought. They all would have taken the exception and considered themselves off the hook. But by their own practices, Jesus revealed that they were in no position to accuse him of helping this distressed man on the Sabbath day. Because here was a man, no, he hadn't fallen into a well, but he was certainly in distress. Certainly there was a danger, a health danger that was burdening him and threatening him. And Jesus was doing exactly what the Sabbath was intended for. Jesus presents the Sabbath day as a day that was for the good of man. In fact, he actually says so. I believe it's back in Matthew, maybe chapter 12. Sabbath was meant for the good of man. It was meant for a day of rest. The Pharisees presented the Sabbath day, though, as if it was a day of restrictions, and that those restrictions had to be kept, no matter what the detriment there were. Sorry, I can't speak. It was a day of restrictions, and those restrictions had to be kept no matter how detrimental they were to the good of men. And Jesus corrects them on this idea several times. Excuse me. Let's see, where was I? Oh, you notice here too, though, that they're trying, Jesus rightfully calls them hypocrites, because what they're doing is they've kind of created one set of laws that they live by, and then another set of laws that they hold everybody else to. Here they are accusing Jesus of doing something that they would be willing to do and to give themselves an exception for. And so this is kind of a mark of hypocrites. You vocally affirm one standard and then you create exceptions for yourself. Sounds kind of like some politicians that I know. But anyway, let's move on. So the lawyers and the lawyers and the Pharisees, they didn't have an argument here. So this was shut down. And they should have been thankful, really, that Jesus shut them down before they had an opportunity to speak and make themselves look even more foolish. They had already been embarrassed. Well, maybe some of the people in this room, but their contemporaries had been embarrassed when Jesus had healed that woman who had the disabling spirit in the synagogue. Jesus had put them to shame by revealing that they actually cared more for their animals than they did for their neighbors, even though the law told them to care for their neighbors. So they kept their mouths shut wisely in this time. And I thought of an application from this text. We need to be careful that we're not like these guys. Before accusing someone or judging someone, we need to take an introspective look at our own lives. And Jesus talks about this in the Sermon on the Mount when he talks about don't go trying to get the log out of your brother's eye when there's don't go trying to get the speck out of your brother's eye when there's a log in your eye. It is really easy to find faults in other people, but it's much harder to recognize them in ourselves. But we need to do the introspection before our hypocrisy is publicly revealed, and we're left like the Pharisees without any answer. So we don't want to end up in this situation. We need to be careful that we're applying the same standards across the board, and that we're applying those standards based on God's principles and God's commands rather than our own traditions. Okay, verse 7 through 11. Now he told a parable to those who were invited, when he noticed how they chose the places of honor, saying to them, when you are invited by someone to a wedding feast, do not sit down in a place of honor, lest someone more distinguished than you be invited by him. And he who invited you both will come and say to you, let me read verse 8 and 9 again, because I'm clearly illiterate. Let me just start over. Here we go. Now he told a parable to those who were invited, when he noticed how they chose the places of honor, saying to them, When you are invited by someone to a wedding feast, do not sit down in a place of honor, lest someone more distinguished than you be invited by him. And he who invited you both will come and say to you, 'Give your place to this person.' And then you will begin with shame to take the lower place. But when you are invited, go and sit in the lowest place, so that when your host comes, he may say to you, 'Friend, move up higher.' Then you will be honored in the presence of all who sit at table with you. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted." So observing the guests who were filling in for this meal at the Pharisees' house, Jesus noticed how they took the best seats possible upon arrival. And as we mentioned in another chapter, in the United States at least, 90% of the time, where you sit around a table really doesn't matter that much. There are occasions, I suppose, when you go to like a black tie event, or maybe a wedding where you're seated shows your relationship to the host, maybe something like that. But 90% of the time, it just doesn't really make that much of a difference. But in Jesus' culture, it did. And this seems like it was just a somewhat common gathering of the Pharisees, but where people were sitting mattered. So the most honored members at the party were given the best seats. So the guests, when they were coming in, they honored themselves by determining themselves worthy of the very best seats available. So they would come in and they would see, oh, there's a seat up there. That's a pretty honorable one. That's in a good spot. I'm going to take that one. Jesus taught them not to do this, not only to save face in this world and then, protect their physical reputation, but also to save their soul in the next. So the earthly lesson here, imagine you're going to a wedding and taking the best seat that you could find, only later to be asked by the host to vacate that seat when a more honored guest arrived. That would be pretty embarrassing if you were asked to move because you just weren't as honorable as this other guy and he needed your seat, right? That'd be pretty embarrassing. Instead of doing that, Jesus was teaching that the Pharisees and the lawyers ought to select seats of least honor. So you would go in, you would pick the least honorable location. And the reason is that when the host saw you in that humble seat, he would say, "Oh, no, you are worthy of more honor than that." And he would ask you to move up to some more honorable seat. Now, if people were around you and they saw that, that would reflect well on your reputation. It would be an increase to your honor and your reputation rather than the first option, which would make you look pretty foolish in front of the people who were there. Okay, so now the spiritual lesson. I don't think that Jesus' intention here was really just to give a lesson on saving face and wedding etiquette or feast etiquette. Just a guess, but I'm thinking that's maybe not the primary focus of his ministry. In observing the actions of the Pharisees and the lawyers, Jesus saw a spiritual problem in their heart. He recognized a pride problem with the people around the table. And if there's anything that God doesn't like, it's pride. Because pride causes men to elevate themselves above, to desire praise and admiration and attention and worship that doesn't belong to them and that they're not worthy of. God doesn't think very highly of men who think highly of themselves. And a man who exalts himself is a man who's attempting to steal something that belongs to God and is forgetting his place as a creation of a greater creator. The Bible teaches repeatedly that those who exalt themselves on earth will be humbled by God. But those who humble themselves on earth, who realize that they're lost without God, who realize that they are saved only by God's grace, those who are poor in spirit, they will be honored in heaven. So I think that's really the the point of Jesus bringing this up. And there's maybe a lesson here for us that sometimes people's earthly actions, the way that they engage in the events of their everyday lives, like going over to somebody's house to eat. Sometimes the way that they act can reveal conditions of their heart that go down deeper and perhaps are a spiritual problem. So just be on the lookout. Don't be too quick to assume that everything that somebody does is a manifestation of a deeper spiritual problem. But sometimes, if we are observant of people in the way they act in their everyday lives, we can learn a lot about where their heart is. And that's what Jesus does here. So the lesson for us from this, and not only for the Pharisees and the lawyers, is that we ought to humble ourselves, recognize our relationship to the Creator, recognize how unworthy we are, recognize how God has saved us from something that we can't save ourselves from. And because of that, we ought to be humble in our relationship to Him and our relationship to other people. We ought to give all the glory back to Him because that's where it belongs, and not try to claim that for ourselves. And if we are humble in that way, then we will be exalted. But let God do the exalting instead of trying to court that favor from men. And, in the end, the exaltation that God will give us, the glory that God will give us will be eternal. The glory that you're going to get from men is going to be, 60, 70, 80 years maximum. Verse 12 through 14. And he said also to the man who had invited him, "When you give a dinner or a banquet, do not invite your friends or your brothers or your relatives or rich neighbors, lest they also invite you in return and you be repaid. But when you give a feast, invite the poor and the crippled and the lame and the blind, and you will be blessed, because they cannot repay you, for you will be repaid at the resurrection of the just." Jesus wasn't done teaching. He had addressed the guests, and now he's going to address the host of this get-together. And he tells him that the next time that he hosts a party or a meal, he should do it differently. Instead of inviting his friends or rich people or relatives or well-connected people, he should invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind. Instead of inviting people who he knew could pay him back for his hospitality, he should invite people who he knew couldn't. And this is pretty relatable, I think, in our world. People often host events to curry favor with others. Cocktail parties and invite-only dinners are used to bring important people together for the purpose of networking. And the meal may cost the host a great sum of money, but in return, they're going to win the favor of influential people. And they know that. The host knows that the friendship of those influential people will give them a return on their investment in the long run. The Pharisees, they were supposed to be models of godly men. And this host, he's a ruler of the Pharisees, so he's somewhere up there on the ladder. Jesus told him that a truly godly man, though, would have invited those who promised him no future return. A godly man would use his blessings to feed people in need. And Jesus could say that because he is the model of the ultimate godly man, and no one practiced this better than Jesus himself. Jesus came to the earth, spent his time, spent his energy, suffered, went through pain, was abused. Why? For people that could pay him back, for valuable networking connections? No, he did that for people who didn't have anything to offer him. We're never repaying Jesus back for that. And the text says, though, well, when we think about this, again, it's a perspective issue. Are we thinking in a long-term perspective, or are we thinking in a short-term perspective? And whose favor do we really want to court? Because, yeah, sure, you can win some business connections and maybe some lucrative connections and make some lucrative partnerships with people, if you're thinking about yourself and you're caught up with yourself and your own goals and your own ambitions and your own dreams, and we have a tendency to, I think, only make decisions that are advantageous to us. We think about, okay, how is what I'm going to do today going to be advantageous to my goals? How is it going to get me to where I want to be? How is it going to get my bank account to where I would like it to be? How am I going to be able to further myself through what I'm doing today? And so we align our actions and the way that we spend our money and the way that we invest our money in, well, it really terminates on us and who we want to be. But and that's a very short-term way of thinking, because us, you and I, again, we're only going to be here maximum, 100 years. Instead, we ought to be thinking about the long term, about whose honor we really want to be courting, and that's God's. So rather than waking up every morning and orienting my actions around who I want to become, I ought to be thinking about, how do I orient my actions around who God wants me to become? Because, well, in doing that, we're going to be mimicking Jesus. We're going to be going out to the crippled and the lame and the less fortunate and the disabled and those who can't pay us back, because that's what mimicking Jesus looks like, and that's who he's called us to be. And that is a sacrifice in the short term. There's no question about it. But all good investing typically requires a sacrifice in the short term to gain something better in the long term. And when we think about the real proper investments that we should be making in the world, we realize that God is the only one who guarantees the long-term investment. Not only that, but Jesus tells this Pharisee that while those people on earth can't necessarily pay you back for this, God will pay you back for this. For you will be repaid at the resurrection of the just. And that return, that reward, that glory that you're going to receive is going to be worth so much more than any sacrifices that you made. So, on the earth, a lot of times our return is proportional to what we put in. But when we're thinking long-term about the reward that God's going to give us, it's not proportional. It's not even close to proportional. We're going to make a few little sacrifices to become Christ-like, to care for people like Christ cared for people, and the reward is going to be astounding at the end. And so it's not only about the reward, it's also about modeling Jesus to other people, so that they can understand who he is, that they can come to him for his grace. And so it's not only about a personal reward, it's also about the long-term benefit of other people. And that's a really beautiful thing. When we think about that kind of an investment, it's not only benefiting us, it's benefiting others as well. And not only that, but the return for both of us will be vastly more than anything that we put into it. It's like a win-win-win across the board. So a lot of us, when we look at this and Jesus is telling us to invite the crippled and the lame and the disabled and the blind, we're like, oh, that sounds like hard work. And it is, but not much is being asked of us in comparison to what has been given to us already and what God promises to give to us in the end. Jesus assured his host that although there was no physical reward, earthly reward necessarily, for meeting the needs of the sick and the poor, those actions would not go unnoticed by God. And he's encouraging him to lay up his treasures in heaven. Do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal, but lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven. Matthew chapter 6, verse 19. And then a final thought and kind of an application from these verses is, notice what Jesus does upon his arrival at this meal. First, he corrects the actions of his guests, and then he corrects the actions of his host. And that's probably about the least tactful thing that he could have done. I think that would probably be considered rude in just about every culture that has ever existed. Like, somebody's inviting you over to their house and instantly you're correcting them on issues. Imagine how you'd be perceived if you were invited to a meal and you started telling your table mates that they were wrong and they need to be corrected, and then you went up to your host and you're like, actually, the next time you do this dinner, let me tell you how you should do it. And I think this is a lesson I'm just seeing repeated again and again in Jesus, and it's somewhat contrary to the way that we teach evangelism in the church, and that is, or spreading the gospel in the church, and that is that tact is not always king. It's not always king. Yes, there's a place to think about our approach and working relationally with people and meeting people where they are and being gentle and teaching the message, but that shouldn't always be that's not always the approach that needs to be taken. Again and again and again, we see Jesus on several occasions being very straightforward, very blunt with his message, and that won him some friends and it made him some enemies, and he was just fine with that because that's the nature of the gospel. And for these people who were going to be hard-hearted and stubborn towards the gospel, he wasn't going to be able to do anything about that, right? Because of the message, the eternal truths that he was going to communicate, they weren't going to change just because somebody was a little bit TO'd at them. And that's going to be the reality in some cases in our lives as well. We're not going to be able to change the message. We don't have that privilege. We don't have that right. We have to preach it faithfully, and that's going to make some people mad. And there are going to be times when it just needs to be said straightforward, put out there for people to hear, and the people that accept it will make some friends, and the people who won't will make some enemies. And at the end of the chapter, Jesus is going to talk about counting the cost and some of the difficulties that his disciples will face, and that's definitely true if we teach like Jesus. So, all right, that is the first half, mostly, of chapter 14, and in the next section, we'll pick up with Jesus telling a parable to that group and teaching them some more. All right, hope you guys have an excellent day. Talk to you later.